Welcome to Under the Rug at Work, where I shine light on issues that are normally swept under the rug. Today, I'm chatting with Alexis Zahner about human leadership. Alexis is the co-director and founder of We Are Human Leaders and the podcast host of the same name. Thank you so much for joining me, Alexis. We were chatting earlier and saying that we have been watching each other's work for a while.
Yeah.
It's great to finally connect, and that we probably should have pressed record when we first started chatting, but we're going to get into the juicy bits now.
Yeah, no, love it. We probably should have hit record an hour ago, but it's good to be here and we'll kick off from now then.
So can you share with us a little bit about your background and experience?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm the co-director of Human Leaders, which is an organization that works in leadership development and team development to create organizations where people thrive. For me, this was born out of a need in my own leadership career. And also even before that, working in organizations where I felt unseen, unheard, unvalued, and sort of led me down a path of a bit of an existential crisis early in my career. Why am I doing this? There's got to be more to life. There's got to be more to a career than feeling this level of just unexcitement in my day to day. So through that, I was fortunate to eventually, after working in a few different jobs across corporate marketing, journalism, and then finally living in Canada for a number of years, where I was a manager at Patagonia, and had my first real experience of working for a brand with strong values, strong vision, and one that really respected and valued the individual contributions. And it really changed my life trajectory, my leadership trajectory. And I always say that was sort of the catalyst moment for me to want to be a better person and a better leader. So it was through that I had my first leadership experience as well, which really kicked my butt. It's one thing to be led and it's another thing to be a leader. And you realize the skills required are so much more than technical knowledge and expertise. So that took me down a path of some self-discovery. I went back to university, did my master's in business psychology, also mindfulness meditation teacher certification to try and help myself be a better leader. And now in our work at Human Leaders, I apply that combination of skills and experience and technical training to help other leaders do the same.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's kind of, as you were talking, I was thinking, oh gosh, ditto, except for
Yeah.
positive experience. Mine was a few negative ones, which meant that
Yeah. Wow.
I don't want that, and there needs to be something better. And as you said,
Totally.
management and leadership skills aren't taught, and we get put into these positions and think, I don't know what to do. So what do? I refer back to my parents because they were the first leaders in my life, or I refer to a really good or a really crappy leader because that's how it was always done, right? And yeah,
Yeah.
organizations like yours are so needed. And I think the difference is that you've come from that place of wanting to be better and through your personal experience. And that's why I love talking to solopreneurs because
Yeah.
we do have that passion and we do have that purpose, and it drives us differently, I think, than the big corporations, if I can
Could
say
not agree
that.
more. Yeah, could not agree more. And it's, I had to have the negative experiences before I had the positive one to really be able to see almost the black and white. Like it was truly two different shades of leadership and company culture that I experienced. And I think when you have that really, really positive experience after a series of quite toxic cultures, you realize that you almost like viscerally cannot walk back into an organization with a toxic culture after that. I just knew that I could never put myself in that position again.
Yeah.
And yeah, I really want to make a difference in other people not having to have some of those negative experiences as well.
It's so true because I remember even on Zoom when you were working from home, you get that gut, I don't want to be here. This is not a safe place. But on the
Totally.
flip side, you can be so excited to see your colleagues and your workmates and get the work done and be the best human you can be
Totally.
in the right environment.
Yeah.
But that's not
Yeah.
taught. Yeah.
Yeah, you're so right. And it's interesting because there's discomfort and feeling challenged and stretched in your work.
Mm.
And then there's feeling like, oh my goodness, I cannot spend another second around these people doing this work in this space. I feel it's almost, it's nauseating. It can be like genuine physiological symptoms in some really extreme cases.
Mm. And that's often where the psychosocial hazards come into things, is
Totally.
that's why people are feeling that way. And you and I
Yeah.
are on a path to help people change that. So
Yeah.
yeah, super excited to have you on board and chatting today. And some people, while we live and breathe this work, some people may not have ever heard about human leadership before. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so human leadership is a methodology that we've developed that is a new way to live and lead. So it's a way that is human-centered by nature, but also looks at developing the individual skill set to become the best version of themselves so they can lead more effectively. I genuinely believe that no one sets out on their leadership journey to do a bad job, to be harmful to other human beings. But as you've mentioned, like anything, it's a learned skill. So if we've not had guidance, if we've not had formal training in this space, we will naturally rely on whatever it is we have developed in the past, or whatever it is we've experienced or seen in the past, whether that's parents, if that's our only experience, perhaps it's school teachers, perhaps it's the culture that we've seen modeled around us if we're in a workplace environment. And certainly I know in some of the organizations that I've worked in, when you are surrounded by people who are leading and behaving in a certain way, it's really hard to almost insubordinate that and do something differently. So the work that we do is really about helping people to align with their true and authentic self, and bring that through in how they lead others, so that both they can be the best leader they can be, but also create an environment where other people can thrive through their work.
Mm. And how does that help create and improve psychological safety in a team?
Yeah, it's a great one. I mean, psychological safety is really rooted in the capacity for people to feel safe in the workplace. And that's safe in a few different ways. That's safe to challenge the status quo. It's safe to show up as their full selves. It's safe to be creative, bring ideas to the table. It's safe to share mistakes. So have that really fearless culture where we can acknowledge challenges, we can acknowledge mistakes, we can acknowledge when things aren't going well. Maybe as a team, we're failing, a product's failing, a service isn't a good idea.
Mm.
So human leadership is really integral to this, because these are the behaviors at an individual level that underpin the capacity for us to build fearless organizations. So human leaders have the ability to hold space for mistake making. They have the ability to build trusting and connected relationships, through being vulnerable, and through having those very human skills that allow other people to show up in the same way. So we see psychological safety as almost a macro level outcome of an organization that can cultivate human leadership at that very fundamental and individual level.
Yeah, and people feel safe to be themselves when the leader
Yeah,
is being themselves as well.
totally. Yeah.
And we all make mistakes. We all get
Yeah.
stressed. We all have currently the cost of living crisis and
Yeah.
all of the things that are going on in the world. And I feel like sometimes when we try and hide that because we feel we need to be the best leader and we need to know everything and do everything and do all the things, it stops us from being who we are. And so what you're saying is getting back to that, getting back to your inner
Yeah.
self and
Yeah.
yeah, leading from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that vulnerability is critical to change, both as an individual, as an organization. So whether that is, a company who's going from strength to strength, wanting to innovate new products, there still requires a level of vulnerability, because vulnerability in an organizational and leadership setting is about identifying the gap between where we are and where we want to be, and saying, hey, I don't know this yet. We don't have this yet. We aren't there yet. Whatever it may be, identifying that gap and then taking ownership for saying, but here's what we're going to do to close that gap.
Mm.
So I think there's sort of this misunderstanding of what vulnerability means. I think it's often bandied around in the same basket as things like oversharing in the workplace, people who are maybe giving everything away, or, telling us about everything their budgie and kid have done this week, when it's not always relevant. I think there's a little bit of a misconception around what vulnerability is. But when we talk about it, we very specifically say it's about identifying the gap, and then identifying, when you want to lead with vulnerability, is identifying what you're going to do to close that gap. And it's absolutely critical in team environment, in an individual, goal setting environment, for leaders, and also to close that, space in the psychological safety gap as well, because we have to be able to talk about the things that aren't going well. We have to be able to talk about the mistakes to ever actually overcome them or change them.
Yeah. I remember in one organization that I was in, I was in an exec meeting and I saw my phone email go off, the work email, and it was the e-news for the organization. And clearly there was no approval process. It was half finished and it was a bit of balls up. And I looked at it and went, it was my team that did it. I looked at it and I was sitting next
These
to the
things
boss
happen.
and I said, look, this has happened. We'll work out a process to make sure it doesn't happen. But there was no, I didn't get angry. There was no point in yelling and screaming at someone. Yes, it went out to a couple of thousand organizations, but there was no real undoing it. But there was also no real harm done. And when I went downstairs after the meeting, they came straight up to me and said, this is what we did. And they were super scared. And I said, look, no problems. How can we make sure that this doesn't happen again?
Yeah.
And that really shocked them because that wasn't the culture of the organization. But again, what are we trying to achieve?
Totally.
What do we want to get out of? And how are we going to get the best out of our team? Screaming at them for a mistake that they knew happened wouldn't have helped at all. So
Totally. And conversely, to your point earlier about, we often bring into our leadership style things that we've experienced in our life and perhaps in our parenting. When I first became a leader, I will be the first to admit that I was pretty awful in a lot of ways. And I grew up in a childhood environment where mistake making was not tolerated whatsoever. So I grew up playing football at quite a high level, and I still recall, God rest his soul, my father coming to my football games, and he used to march up and down the sideline, and every single mistake that I made, he would yell at me and tell me the mistake I made. And I remember being all of probably 14 or 15 years old, where I had a family meeting and I decided to ban him from my football games. Because I was just like, Dad, you make everything worse. Like, I know I missed the pass, I missed the tackle, I missed the shot. I am well aware of the mistake. No one feels stupider than me in that moment.
yeah.
And all you're doing is doubling down on the stupidity I feel, on the hopelessness I feel. People already experience guilt and shame in those moments. So I think when you publicly remind them of that, it only serves to make the situation worse. However, that was a pattern of behavior that I'd experienced for 15 years, as a teenager. And not from a place of not being loved by my parents, but from a place of them thinking that that was what they needed to do to make me better at what it was I was trying to achieve. But it was just a learned behavior. And so I brought that with me in my leadership. And I was pretty awful at leadership the first go around, because I just thought, hey, if we just hold people really accountable for their behavior, and I was mistaking accountability for blaming, and reminding people, hey, this was a mistake, you have really made a mistake here, versus letting people own their mistakes on their own, accord, and then working together to overcome it so it doesn't happen again, is very, very different. And I think we need to also hold space for people who might have had an experience like mine and might not understand that that's actually not accountability, that's, shaming or blaming. But that's okay. If that's the only way that you've learned how to do something, it's okay, but you have to take ownership for being better and learning a new way of being.
Yeah. And I think these examples are great because people who are listening, like, same thing. When I was a new manager, there was no toolkit, there were no tools. I
Yeah.
had big influencers that were quite passive aggressive. So
Yeah.
that was my style, not realizing that that's what it was. And
Yeah.
my work ethic was always quite high, because to succeed is to achieve. So
Yeah.
again, I was very much like that in the start. And it was a few things. Like I had one uh, colleague who came over, and it was actually quite funny. I locked myself in the bathroom and I was stuck in there for about, the lock broke, stuck in there for about
Oh,
15 minutes from trying to get out. And I came out and I told the team, and we were an open plan office, and everyone laughed. And I had a colleague that I really respected, and she came over and said, "That's the first time I've seen your team laugh. It was really great to do that." And I'd only been in the role for like 2 weeks, so luckily it was picked up early.
yeah. Wow.
But I listened to that and went, that is not how I want to be perceived. That is not
Totally.
the way I want to lead. I want it to be fun all the time, or as much as possible. So
Yeah.
for me, that was a real eye opener. And I think we need to really be able to give ourselves a break to say we're not perfect, but we need to be aware. And
Yeah.
hopefully, some of the examples that we're sharing today will help people go, oh, yeah, maybe I've seen that, or I'm doing that. And if that's you,
Totally.
that's okay. Just
Yeah.
what's the next step, and how can you be more human? How can you, increase your vulnerability? How can you help your team be better? And one of the things that I've heard you say that I think ties in really well with this, and I'm pretty sure it's on your website as well,
Yeah.
is that you don't intentionally create a healthy culture, you'll be left with a toxic one.
Yeah.
I think some of the examples we've shared really kind of nail that. But what do you think the key is, or what's some advice that you can provide people to create that healthy culture?
Well, firstly, I think it's important to ask the question of what is culture, because I think people don't often understand what ingredients go into making up a culture. And as Simon Sinek famously puts it in his equation, it's behaviors times consistency. So it's what you're doing time and time and time again. And so why this is important to consider when we're speaking about, a healthy culture or a toxic culture, is often because we hear leaders say that what they have in front of them, the culture they have in front of them, wasn't one that they created. However, by virtue of doing nothing and allowing things to be as they are, you are making a choice. Every second, every minute, every day, every week that you're in a leadership position, doing nothing is a choice as much as intentionally choosing to change things as they are. So what we mean by that is that we have to also, to change a culture, be very intentional about the things that we are willing and not willing to accept, and put into place what we call operating principles. So we often work with teams to look at things like their values, which are beautiful statements that often never make it further than the company wall or the employee handbook. So we look at taking things like value statements and operationalizing these into operating principles. So these are statements of behaviors of how we do things around here. So these might be, for example, things such as, we innovate to constantly delight our customers. Okay, that might be a great value statement for a company, but what does that mean? When are you innovating? How are you innovating? For whom? How often? What does this look like? So we turn those statements into actionable behaviors, really. And it's when we then can hold ourselves accountable towards these list of behaviors and check ourselves, put checking mechanisms in place, that we actually can be intentionally creating a culture where what we want to see in the world around us is actually what we're experiencing.
Mm. Yeah. And ask yourself, if you're listening to this, what kind of culture or environment do we have in the team? And if
Yeah.
you're super brave, ask your team and be
Yeah.
okay with the answers, because it is what it is. And
Yeah.
then ask, where do you want to be? And often that, from where you are to where you want to be, is it can be challenging, because we're so busy
Yeah.
doing the work as leaders. And
Yeah.
leading a team, as you said, it takes a completely different skill set. It's not just about doing the work or dictating to people as to what work they need to do. So to
Yeah.
get support from, yourself and an organization like yours is something that I would highly recommend, because if it was easy and we would all be doing it.
Totally. And there's a level of discomfort, whether you're listening to this conversation as an individual leader and thinking, yeah, I might have some toxic behaviors, or I'm noticing this in my team, or at a company level, we have to fight the resistance to do nothing and step into the discomfort of owning change that needs to happen, because we often forget that we have to let go of who we are or where we are to actually chase what it is that we're looking for, or intentionally align with those behaviors we want. And to do that, there has to be things that let go rather along the way. So, to your question, that's such a good question. What is it in the environment now, or what is it in our culture now that isn't serving us? Like, what are the small behaviors? Are we accepting passive aggressive behavior? Are we accepting, as per my last email, behavior? Like, okay, if you accept that 1,000 times, don't tell me why you don't have a toxic culture. Like that, there's small things where we allow those interactions to go unnoticed or unchecked that end up manifesting into a big old toxic environment.
Yeah, and it really is the tiny stuff that's just accepted. And if the tiny things are accepted, it just grows from there. And then all of a sudden you're on the front page of the newspaper or in the media, because you haven't been able to have open conversations to
Totally
listen and make changes. And on your discomfort point, if you're comfortable, then you're not changing, and if you're comfortable, you're not growing. And yeah, for growth and development and innovation and improvement, it is an uncomfortable process. I mean, think when you're small to when you grow into the adult size human you are, it's not an easy growth thing. So being uncomfortable is a good thing. Unless it's in that piteous stomach where you really don't want to be here, we've got to be able to differentiate those things. But yeah, definitely go with the discomfort, because it will lead you to better places.
For sure. And I think that discomfort might just look like a time and energy investment, because the one thing I hear so often from leaders is, we don't have the time to do this. Where would we put this into the calendar? Well, you're already having team meetings. You're already doing all of these other things. It's about doing those things differently. It's not about trying to put more into the calendar. It's about reframing what your priorities are and how you're doing those things, so it doesn't have to be anything crazy and drastic. The discomfort comes from just not accepting that you don't have time to do things, and pushing yourself to find a way to do it, and just implementing it in small incremental ways.
And you can be more efficient with that as well. If you
Totally.
learn these things to grow and change, then you'll look back and go, I can't believe I was wasting all that time.
Totally. Yep. You have to start somewhere though, huh?
Alexis, this has been such a great conversation. I'm sure there's going to be more. If people want to find out more about you, what's the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, for sure. So our website is www.wearehumanleaders.com. On there, you'll find the work we do for individual leaders and for teams. You'll also find our podcast, which is in its second season now. You can also find myself, Alexis Zahner, on LinkedIn, as well as We Are Human Leaders. And I'm always delighted to connect with people who, are interested in the work that we're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great.